So let me tell you, while we wait for the actual slides, the very start, which is what the project is about, how the data is constructed, and what kind of challenges we were actually encountering. So the program that we're looking at is called Better Choices, Better Health. And it's a program that initially came out of Stanford University. And they transformed it into a workshop that used to be face-to-face and today is also done online. And the company I'm with, Canary Health, is working with this program. They're running it. They're taking care of those 6 weeks where the people with chronic conditions, basically, they learn these skills at home. It's free for participants, and that improves their health outcomes so that when they do go to the hospital or when they do communicate with their doctors and so on and so forth, they can actually have skills, which we call self-management skills in the field, to be active participants in their healthcare. And the thing that we noticed that was very strange was, why do some people actually do really well when they go into the program and they finish it and they stellar participation? Oh, you can't hear me anymore. That is quite a problem. You can. Okay, great. I'm seeing here a lot of comments. Great. So can everyone hear me? Yeah. Yes, perfect. All right. So the question that we had was, why do some participants do really, really well and some participants really struggle? They start the program, they can't finish it because, at the core of it, people who sign up obviously were motivated. They could do great, wanted to have great health outcomes. So what makes it, right? That they make it or don't. And the second question, which is really what we were interested in, was, what if by understanding people a little bit better, the participants, and understanding the difference between those two groups, could we tailor the support for each participant so that we can help them in a way that works for them to reach their healthy lifestyle goals? So here's how we went about it. On the next slide, you're going to see there's 4 different points, right? 4 different first steps, if you want, before you actually even get into MaxQDA. The goal is to get the participant interviews, right? Because that's how you do grounded theory. Oh, glad to hear, Sherry, that it overlaps the research. Yeah, so the participant interviews, they go into MaxQDA, and that's where you're doing the grounded research theory. But before even getting there, right, the first question you want to ask is, well, who should we interview? Who should be part of this set? And there's many ways to go about this, of course. One way that's kind of maybe unusual, at least for the academia world, is maybe going to a database of people who are already enrolled in the program. And that's something that if you are working in the field, that's great, because that's data that the company or the organization already owns, right? It's been collected, it's there. And instead of going and starting from scratch, you're using some of the things that are already being in use, right? That are already there for you. And you can kind of build on top of that. So that's what we went into. We went into the database. It contained all of the participants that had taken the program, for the last few years. And we decided, let's do our research with people who actually came in, because that's the greatest way to classify them. And you'll see this is a common theme in this research. The idea of classification is quite important, right? So as you're looking at the database, you have these distributions, essentially, right? We're trying to see what is the attendance like from 0 all the way to 6. So 0 sessions attended, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is, has completed every single step in the program. And what we started noticing there was, off the bat, very often in an academic world, we learn about normally distributed data sets. This was not normally distributed. This was what we would call bimodal, right? It was really 2 different distributions that coexisted together. So we decided, okay, let's make 2 different groups. Group 1 is going to be the people who had 0 or 1 attendance, which means basically people who couldn't finish or even start, really get off the ground and really run with the program. And the other group, group 2, was people who had 6 attendances, because that means it was very clear they finished it. They were really, really proficient or effective at it. So now we had our 2 groups, and we were able to go and basically go back into the database, fetch the emails, and contact them for the recruitment. And of course, we did the screening and the selection. But by that time, we knew that the interviews we were holding really were the correct population. All right, so now we have this data and it's sitting in MaxQDA. And what you're going to see now is this other approach, which is we have on the next slide, we have the data on one side, which is the qualitative data, and we have the program database, which actually holds, numbers and background information that we need to understand a little bit better the participants that were chosen. But at this point, even though the data set, it is, as you would agree, quite a small data set. And the question becomes, can I use a small data set such as this one to have statistical inference? Meaning, can the small qualitative sample that I have be representative of the bigger population I'm trying to represent? And this is really fantastic and a game changer. And of course, the answer is yes, and we'll go through MaxQDA with the binary variables to do that. But I just want you to take a moment to understand how amazing this fact is, because up until now, exploratory research was very often disconnected from the greater population, and you needed to run sort of extra tests on the side, maybe have some kind of quantitative research on the side that took those first qualitative findings to try to figure out if they work for a broader population. But now there's a way of doing that in MaxQDA, which is absolutely fantastic, and it is coding and quantifying for the hypothesis testing. So let me show you how we do that. So you have two different ideas here. I'm going to start with the one on the right-hand screen. So we have the data set on top. We know that, right? There's the qualitative research participants. There's the database that provides us with numbers that we can cross. But how do you mix the two, right? How do you get the insights from both? The trick is you need to start coding things that were of a qualitative nature into things that become quantitative, because the ultimate goal is basically hypothesis testing. So we go from the qualitative data analysis, which is grounded theory essentially, right? So you're going through, you're finding the themes, but then instead of just having the values, right, the variables be those different categories, you're going to turn those variables in MaxQDA as binary variables. A binary variable is a variable that has either 1 or 0. So if I say, for example, people in this room that have blue eyes, if your eyes are blue, you would count as 1. And if your eyes were brown or gray or another color, you would count as 0. So you suddenly switch something that I couldn't really count into something that I'm able to quantify, right? That's the binary variable. And that binary variable is then entered in the stats module. So I believe you need the Pro suite to be able to do that in MaxQDA. But basically, you enter those variables there in a way that sets up what we call the hypothesis testing. And you're probably familiar with that because it is quite a common way of looking at data sets. Basically, you're trying to determine, and I'll show you much more concretely what that looks like in our example here, but you're trying to determine, is the difference that we notice from group A to group B statistically significant? Is it likely to happen, so it's just a coincidence? Or is it something so unlikely that we have to conclude that there's something going on there, which is our hypothesis that we're testing? So two ways in which you're going to do that. The first one I've just covered is the binary variables from the grounded theory coding. That's what you see at the bottom left. And at the top here, you see something called metadata. So MaxQDA also supports, it is in your documents, right? When you're going into the participant interviews, you can insert metadata at the document level, which means instead of having the code be about each line and each theme you find in the lines in your transcript, you can also go one level up and start tagging things like the participants, right? So one of the things that we could do is classification. If the participant was from group A or group B, you can write this as a metadata little block on the top of your document, and you can specify the individual is from group A, and you can tag that, right? You can code that as a binary variable also, so that when the two data sets meet, you have the themes and you have the characteristics that you were measuring with those participant interviews. All right, where'd you get that information? I prepared for you a little slide that shows you the different places. I think MaxQDA is fabulous in terms of giving us a lot of background information. So you can actually go online on YouTube channels, and there's two that I would highly recommend. Of course, the MaxQDA channel itself, and Christine Silver, who also happens to have a couple of sessions at MAXDAYS. She's fabulous, always has these very insightful um, classes, I think I would call them, or presentations. Definitely worth checking out. And both of those actually have all the information you need to do what I've just described here. So the document variables in MaxQDA was one of the videos that is really informative about that. The other one is statistical analysis with the stats module in MaxQDA. And the third one, which might not appear right off the bat as obvious, is this idea of literature review. I really love the one that Christina Silver did, which is basically because you're going to use grounded theory coding. And I think even though you're not technically doing literature review, you can use the same mechanisms that you use in a literature review applied to the the documents, the interview, the participant interviews that you collected. It's the exact same mechanics of it, right? In terms of tools and how you're gonna code the data and look at this data. And this really describes the entire flow, because you'll be starting at the bottom with a literature review, and then you'll be going up to dealing with document variables, and then you'll be going again towards the statistical method. So it's a full circle there, and you really get to see all of the functionalities really well explained in those videos. But what I'm going to take you to is one level up, just to understand conceptually what you're trying to do here. And that is that at the top, you still have that data set that we talked about, right? You have the participant interviews, the program database, and now you're actually going into, okay, but what do we do? How do we put these blocks back to back, right? So the first one was that document that lives in MaxQDA, which you had that. And you had all of those codes that you put in. So that's the step I've just showed you right before. You should be ready. You should be good to go. You have that document set. But now, what happens? You're moving into that second phase, which is called hypothesis testing. And the basic principle of it, how you have to think about it, is that you're subsetting your results. You have group one, which is the people who, in our case here, did poorly and struggled to finish the program. And then you had group two, in our case here, it's the people who actually were able to complete it. And those two groups, we need to compare them, but obviously, as you understand the principle, to compare something, you need to compare them across a same characteristic, right? It's what we would call that binary variable. And normally you can have more than one binary variable. Here I only put one to keep this light, but in reality we had many, right? And you're trying to see for that binary variable number one, is the behavior or what you're observing in group one the same or different than group two? And at that stage, that's all you're trying to set up, right? This, by the way, brings me to tell you how you define those variables is very important. And I think that's the work of the researcher. To a large extent, the software is very easy to use. That's not where the difficulty lies. I think the creative effort is how do you make sense within the research that you have of what those variables should be, what should you be measuring. That is kind of where your expertise will really shine through, right? And from that, you want to go to a third step, because it's not enough to see the differences, because you're going to get numbers, but then you have to interpret those numbers, right? And this is where I combine two different things, MaxQDA primarily, but also R as a second stage, and I'll explain a little bit why. But basically what we wanted to do was, okay, we have these differences, but first of all, are they significant? And this is an answer that you get from the module that I just showed you earlier with stats in MaxQDA. So you run a hypothesis testing and you see whether or not the difference, is significant. If it comes back that yes, it's significant, then that means that hypothesis you had is valid. And if it does not come back conclusive, then you don't have enough, data to say that you really can go with that hypothesis. In our case, we had 3 hypotheses set up, and only one of the 3 turned out to be valid, right? Statistically valid. And the reason this is, so interesting for us is because again, when you first see those numbers, it's, the qualitative research gives you very good paths, to consider what might be going on with this data set, right? With those participants. They're very good first steps to narrowing down, right? Instead of, because if you were to measure, what would you measure? You don't know. That's why we go into that early exploratory phase. We want to go and really try to see on the field what could be the cause of what we're observing, right? But at that stage, it's really great to have a lay of the land, right? To have the scope of what could be going wrong, right? Or right. But you're unable to distinguish which of these options should really be the one you invest in. And if you're going to go down that route, this is where adding that stats module really makes a difference, because up until now, we only had reasonable ideas of what might be going on. But I want to remind you that the sample is small. A qualitative sample, by definition, tends to be small, right? Which makes sense because you're going in depth, you're trying to interview people, and the richness is in those nuances and those details and those stories. But to see that inference that we saw much earlier on, to see if it applies to a broader population, you need to narrow that down that further, right? And the way you do that is through that hypothesis testing feature that we have in MaxQDA. And once you have that, it might have been the end of it. You could have said, okay, we now know what might work, why the underlying thing is happening. But we decided to go a step further. This is where I brought R as an extra step here, because it allowed us to say, okay, we now know which hypothesis is actually most likely here, but I wanted to understand even a little bit further, how do we identify these people, right? And this turns into real world research, because there's a difference between knowing how I'm going to classify you, like which bucket you belong to, which is a good first step, but then it's a whole different ballgame to know, well, how will I know? Because think about it, when people come into the program, we have no data about them. The way we knew where to classify you in step 2 was simply because we had the data in that database that you see on top, right? I could go and look for a participant, their ID, because it's all de-identified, and I could see which of actually they observable data, where they fell in. But when you have someone who's brand new and joining a program, your intent, if you want to help them early on to be able to keep up with the program and reach the healthy living outcomes, very early on, you don't know which profile you're dealing with. I don't know if the person is group 1 or group 2. And so I needed to go a step beyond just observing this data and understanding what are maybe pointers which would enable us to understand what we're dealing with early on, so we can actually provide support, right? So this is the step where we designed profiles. We basically did a little online tool that allows people, like a quick quiz they can take, and based on the quiz, we're able to tell, okay, you belong to group 1 or group 2, and based on that, we have a pretty solid understanding of what we might be doing early on to help them stay on track, but in a personalized way, in a way that represents that group. So let me show you on the next slide what the outcome really was, right? What the results were. And then we'll move on to questions, because I'm very curious to see if there's any questions in the audience. But as a very high level, right? We had phase 1 where we had group 1 and group 2. And what this information gave us through the study was, okay, there's profiles, which is already something good to know, because, we split them into group 1 and group 2, not arbitrarily. But group 1 and group 2, we know it's observed, but can you really make a profile out of it? And the research results that we got said, yes, you can. And then the second level that this looked at was the preferences. So in terms of the profile 1 and 2, we know where you fall because of that analysis with the hypothesis testing, right? But what we know from the qualitative research, which is the grounded theory part that we did, that's the preference that you have. Because from all of the things we heard in the interviews, we can now categorize them as almost like clusters, right? We have one group, we have another group, and you can filter that also through the codings when you're looking through your results in MaxQDA, and you get to see what each profile preferred, right? And that also brings us to understand the challenges in the exact same way. What did they talk about during the interviews? How were these challenges different? And based on that, and on the correlation study that we did, because we transformed those also in variables, we were able to bring it down to 3 questions, and which is very important, I should add, because that's also another constraint if you're kind of trying to apply your findings in the real world. People will not spend a lot of time looking, and reading and taking a lot of time going through 6-page questionnaires. So you've got to be very succinct. And to be succinct, you got to know what really matters, right, in the data to be measured and what's kind of noise, and you can be ignoring it. So we boil it down to 3 questions. And the other thing that was really nice about this is the questions we asked were not obvious positional questions, because remember, this is healthcare. So this is a sensitive topic, and people also want to look good, right? Which is a bias when you're doing interviews. If you're putting out a question, a questionnaire that is a little bit too intrusive or asks things that people might feel uncomfortable revealing, then you're probably not going to get the right answers back, and you won't be able to have that categorization take place. So we had to be very careful, and that's where those correlations came in really handy. When we saw very strong correlations with those profiles, these are questions that were tangential and were more delicate. They weren't as direct as, things that might make people feel defensive or uncomfortable, or like it's too private to share. And so it was a sidestepping way for us to get to that information. But once we did profile them, it allowed us to then say, okay, we know which group you're in, so we know what the challenges are, so we know how to better help you and support you, which is great, right? And from that stage, we're entering now phase 2, which is the upcoming steps for us. Having research is really great, and the research in itself is conclusive, right? But then the next phase for us is to know, okay, well, we want to go a step further, because now, remember that inference that we were talking about? We went from a small sample to a really large population. So the question now becomes, well, are these questions accurate predictors within a larger sample, right? We know that the profiles are, because that's what the hypothesis testing allowed us to do. But in terms of actionable terms, right? The 3-question questionnaire quiz in R is just a correlation. It is not a hypothesis testing like we did in MaxQDA. So for that, we have a hunch that these are interesting questions, but are they the best questions, right? Are they good predictors for the large sample? And also there's, considerations when you're implementing something, like, is the wording the best? There's things like that when you hit the real world, it's gotta, the rubber meets the road. So the implementation really matters too. And the second thing that we want to see is, okay, we know from the research, because there's things we know and things we don't know. At that point, when you've completed this research, you have a pretty good sense of what the strategies, for engagements could be. That what you do know for sure is what are their preferences, what are their challenges, and that the fact that there are profiles, right? The 2 unanswered questions are the questions we picked the best predictors or good enough predictors with larger samples? And the second question, which is the one I'm talking about now, is, okay, great, we've identified which profile you are, but if we're gonna have engagement strategies based on those profiles we identified, which of these strategies works best? Because it's one thing to theoretically know what those profiles are, and it's another thing to see which recommendation really sticks and works in the real world. But all of this research helps us orient us early on, so that by the time we run this, in the programs and so on, the research informed, the what's possible, narrowed down options, and helps us focus, which is very strategic, right? In the real world, if you're working in a healthcare organization, you don't have all the resources in the world. You want to be efficient, and that research helps us hone in on what might have the best options. So just to finish, I'm putting here 2 books that I'm recommending, although more generally, I'm going to talk to you about what I think is necessary to do a project like that. MaxQDA is really not difficult. And Olivier, who is asking, are you going to demo this on MaxQDA? You can go back to the slide where I showed you the videos. The 3 videos show you exactly the steps that I used, right? But these 3 videos, they're exactly step by step. They show you the interface. They're going to show you. I cannot physically show you because the data is de-identified, but it's also under in healthcare, we're not allowed to disclose any data for patients. But in these videos, you'll find it's extremely clear and they show you very concrete examples. But the knowledge that is not contained in those videos, which is what I'm suggesting in those 2 books, is something about categorization, which is quite that's the name of the game, right? I have to say, I think the hardest thing in this project was knowing how are we going to put people into categories that make sense. And then the second thing was correlation, because hypothesis testing will only get you so far. If, sometimes you need to kind of bridge that gap between the qualitative and the quantitative, and you might need tools like correlation. So those 2 books, but any books really that talk about correlation, even hypothesis testing if you're new, and most of all, categorical data analysis, those are going to be foundational and a great complement to those videos we just showed, which are really focused on the tool itself. But this is kind of the strategy before you get into the tool. So that is my part of the presentation. I wanted to open the floor to hear a little bit some questions. And I see that they're already starting to trickle in the chat. So does the company have pretend cases that take one through a study? We don't, but if we ever do, I can get back to Hannah and share. So the research we do is very applied because we're trying to, solve issues. So we didn't invest in making side cases. I think Sherry, though, you're right. One of the difficult things, I think, if you're starting out, like I said, MaxQD is really great. Everything flew really well. The documentation for it is really there. The thing that's really hard is understanding how should you construct your own research, right? Because you're not going to have the same exact setup than me. You're not going to have the same access to information. And so I think to a large part, the challenge is going to be, okay, how do I use those tools that are kind of available and very easy to use, but how do I devise a strategy that really works for that? And so don't hesitate to reach out to me if I can help. But yeah, it's hard. Oh, I had not planned. Okay, so Matthew's asking if I plan on writing a guidebook for Max Press. That way it would be available to us all. With pleasure. We haven't spoken about that, but yes, I definitely think Max Press has extraordinary good books. I know that there's been also demos, and I think during MAXDAYS there's going to be demonstrations also for the stats module that you can go look at. So yeah, definitely, I think that these are great resources. MaxQDA do they have guidelines to codify variables? I would again invite you to really follow. There's a lot of methodology workshops this year in MaxDAYS, and even in previous years. Look at everything that has to do with literature review, grounded theory, but also the actual MaxQDA has manuals basically where they show you functionalities. They're really, really well explained. The how to code is another topic, and there are books too, and you might want to go read just the theory of coding. MaxQDA really reflects that workflow, which is something that I find really extraordinary. If you do happen to read a theory book on coding and then open MaxQDA, you'll see it really mimics the same flow. It's been thought in the same logic, so you can learn interchangeably, I would say. The MaxQDA is not really hard to use, right? You can easily make codes. The question is, how do you structure those codes? And I think there's like 15 different ways or something, maybe more, in which you can actually, oh, there you go, how to code. Hannah just put a link in the notes there, so definitely have a look. But there's I think 15 different ways. Grounded theory is one of them. There are other methods, right? And the main difference, just for really quickly, for the sake of those wondering which one should I use, grounded theory, the reason we used, because you're not imposing a framework on participants. For my research, it was extremely exploratory, and you have to ask yourself the question, where are you on that spectrum, right? That how to code, like physically coding, is the same no matter what it is, right? No matter what which method you choose, the act of coding in MaxQDA will be identical. The kind of strategic level question you have to ask yourself is, okay, what am I trying to do? Because from one end of the spectrum, grounded theory basically means I come in and I have no prejudice, right? I have no idea what these participants are going to talk about. And this is exactly my case, right? I know that some are failing, some are succeeding, but I have no idea why, right? And if I orient my line of questions in a way that is filled with sort of bias, like my own ideas of why, then I'm directing them somewhere, but I might be missing out really important things I didn't think through, right? So at this very early stage, what I do is the opposite, and that's where grounded theory comes in. I let the participant tell me what they want, and when I go into MaxQD and code it, I pay attention to the things that are recurring and that show up, and that's the things I'm going to code, but it comes from them. It doesn't come from me. However, there's other models. Sometimes you do work, like for example, if you had motivational styles in healthcare, right? This is wildly researched. If you're going down that path, there are frameworks, there are ways in which you could align your coding to test or represent something that has been evidence-based in the field, right? If that's the type of research you're doing, then your coding will not be grounded theory, it will be something else. So that's the only question I would really just ask up front. But as Hannah shared, the How to Code is an excellent guide. And if you go into any literature review actually or grounded theory workshop during the next 2 days, you're going to see them in action. It's very simple and it shouldn't be too hard. Thank you for sharing this, Karina. It is great to learn that this can be done so efficiently. Yeah, absolutely. So efficiently in MaxQDA. It's a very, very easy tool. I think the difficulty when you first enter is if you're new to it, it might feel a little bit overwhelmed. And I know that they've changed a little bit the UI, so it might have even improved since we ran that. But I would say don't worry too much about it. Christina Silver actually has a really good book on the strategy of how to think about, your research. And I think that's the real place to start. The tool can do anything you want it to do. The question is just taking a step back, break it down in small steps. It's very right? Very logical. And typically if you're blocked on a specific point, if you just look it up on YouTube, they have a great library of resources, or the actual documentation is also stellar. So if you kind of think through agnostically, like don't think through in terms of features when you first start. Think through in terms of how would I solve this? What steps would I take? And then whenever you're blocked somewhere, that's when you research how is this done in MaxQDA. That's kind of like step number 2. And that's, I think, going to help you a lot. And I'm sure if you write, there must be a forum or other places where you might be able to fetch or reach out to fellow researchers, right? I think there is a very big community. I think a lot of people have done a lot of those things. So it's a 2-minute away email. Very helpful advice. Thanks. My pleasure, Sherry. Matthew, thank you for this session. Very informative. Glad to have been helpful. So I think we've reached the end of this session. What do you think? Fantastic. And don't hesitate, if anyone has extra questions after this session, you can always email me. Great. Enjoy the rest of the conference.